Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again for another video. And today I'm setting up my bullet journal for February. I'm a couple days late, but better late than never. I wanted to keep this monthly setup pretty simple overall. I've been very busy since the beginning of 2023, and I just wanted to do something relatively quick that would still have a little bit of a design element, because y'all know I do love a nice aesthetic. I decided that the best way to keep it simple while still having a little bit of artistic flair would be to create some artwork for the cover page and then to keep the rest of the setup very simple. I was really inspired to do some mountain-related artwork for this theme. So for the cover page, I wanted to have two pieces of art that sort of mirror each other. One as sort of the cover page art and one as a quote page. And I knew I wanted to use watercolor to paint the backgrounds and to do some mixed media, combining watercolor and line art. So I'm starting with the backgrounds. And as I said, I wanted them to sort of mirror each other, but also contrast each other. So I wanted to create backgrounds that looked like the night sky and also golden hour. And I'm using a larger flat brush to try to get a nice, even, smooth wash of color. I'm going for a little bit of a gradient feel on both of these, but obviously using different color palettes for each. So starting with my clean flat brush, I'm just wetting it and wetting the paper so that I can use the wet on wet technique to try to get a smoother blend. I would recommend wetting your page enough that you can see a bit of a sheen on the paper when you move your head to get different angles of the light, but try to avoid using so much water that you end up with pools of water on the page, because that is just going to make the effect you're going for a little harder to achieve. Once I have the background wet, I'm using the same flat brush and picking up some color, keeping the brush quite wet and just working in gentle strokes back and forth, working from the top down and from the bottom up to slowly get a bit of a gradient from darker at the top to lighter at the bottom. Full transparency, I tried painting these backgrounds two times before this third attempt that turned out the way I wanted, and I did learn some things that I want to share from those first two attempts. The biggest thing that made a really big difference in getting the effect I was going for was being patient and working in many more layers, picking up only a little bit of pigment at a time, blending it out smoothly, and continuing to add and add and add to these paintings, sometimes alternating between one and the other to give the paint a little bit more time to dry. Working in a lot more light layers was so much easier than trying to get it all done in just a few layers, as I did in my first two attempts. They just didn't turn out the way I was envisioning. One thing to keep in mind when you are working in layers is in future layers, once you've let the paint that's already on the page mostly dry or entirely dry, you do have to start using a little less water than you were at the beginning to try not to disturb or lift the paint underneath. This can be a bit of a fine balance because you want enough water that you can get a smooth blend of the layer you're working on, but you don't want so much that you are creating pools on the page or, again, lifting that lower layer of paint. I kind of liked the slight streakiness I was getting from using this medium-sized flat brush, though if I wanted it to be a smoother gradient with less visible horizontal lines, a larger brush and more water would help me achieve that. Again, just continuing to work in layers and mixing slight variations on my colors to get that gradient look. The night sky was mostly indigo with some Payne's gray and a tiny bit of lamp black to really darken the top. And my golden hour painting, I was using yellow ochre with a little bit of Van Dyke brown, and surprisingly enough, also using a little bit of lamp black on the golden hour painting just to reduce the saturation of the yellow a little bit. Once the gradients were fully dry, I came back in with a much smaller flat brush, a little angle brush, to work on creating some sort of hills or mountains at the bottom of the page. These are meant to look like different sections of a mountain range where the darker mountains are in the foreground and the lighter mountains further away that are sort of disappearing into the mist of the sky, getting a little less distinct the further away they are. Again, just using combinations of the colors I used for the background and working again in layers, trying to start as much as possible light and adding more pigment later if I feel like I wanted to darken up one section or another. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted these to mirror each other, but I didn't want to make them perfect mirror images or clones of each other. I wanted them to definitely feel like they're part of a set, but to have their own unique features. So I'm trying to generally match the scale of these hills or mountains and the sort of overall shape without trying to keep them too similar. Once I had the background layers, I wanted to work on the foreground layer, which is going to be the darkest. My vision was to do my line art mountains behind this foreground range that's very dark and in front of the lighter mountain ranges behind. Once those lower sections were fully dry, I grabbed one of my Sakura microns, this is the 02 nib, and started working on drawing my mountain ranges. Now you can't see it, but I did do a very light sketch in pencil just to get the general scale and shape of the main section of the mountain range, just as a reference while I'm drawing. I used a very light hand so that I wouldn't have to use too much pressure with my eraser to get rid of the lines later. I started with those basic shapes for the mountains and added just a couple little lines for detail on the mountain face. And then on the side of the mountain, I used many diagonal lines to create a shadow effect, a little bit of interest. And I really like how this looks with the more minimalist line art style of these mountains. Once I had that shaded area in, I felt like the mountains looked just a little bit light. They didn't sort of jump off the page as much as I wanted. So I went back in with the same fine liner and just darkened up those outside edges, thickened them up in some areas. I wasn't too precious about perfectly going over the first line. I allowed my lines to be a little bit wavier to get some thicker areas, some thinner areas. I just wanted to define the mountains a little bit more and have them stand out a bit more from the background, especially on the night sky version because the background is darker. Once I was happy with my mountain ranges, I covered up all the areas I didn't want to have any stars with some paper towel, and I used some white gouache on a very fine brush, quite wet, and splattered the white paint to create a smattering of irregular stars. Once that was dry, I removed all the tape, my favorite part, and scanned these paintings so that I could print them out on regular printer paper. Those of you who have been hanging out with me the last couple months will know I've started doing a lot more paintings that I keep for myself and scan for use in my bullet journal. I don't always do that. I do still sometimes paint directly into my bullet journal, but it is nice to have some of those original paintings preserved outside of my bullet journal that I can just keep in my office or tack up on the wall or something. And I was really happy with how these two paintings turned out. And it is nice to be sticking just printer paper into my bullet journal rather than watercolor paper because it's so much less stiff and bulky. And my bullet journal always gets very bulky anyway, but it is nice to try to keep down the bulkiness when possible. Once I had those glued in, I grabbed my stamp set and just stamped February at the bottom of the painting on the left, and stamped my quote for the month on the painting on the right. And the quote I chose for this month was, "The best view comes after the hardest climb," which felt not only relevant to a theme with mountains, but also just a reminder to keep going and that all the hard work is worth it. Even when sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees and you feel overwhelmed and tired and burnt out, hard work is worth it and you will have that amazing view when you reach the top. It just takes time sometimes. Once I was happy with how the spread turned out, I flipped the page to work on my calendar spread. And for my calendar, I wanted to keep it very simple, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, but I still wanted to incorporate the mountain theme, just in a more minimalist, simplistic way. So what I decided to do was create my calendar completely on the left side of the page, and then to draw a mountain range in the same line art style as I did on my 2 paintings for the cover and the quote page, but without any color, just the line art as sort of the artistic feature on this spread. So that was my concept going into it, and I was a little worried at one point that maybe it wasn't going to turn out the way I'd hoped, but when everything was done, I felt like it had come together and I was quite happy with it. I wanted my mountain range to cross over both pages, and again I used a pencil with a very light hand to just sketch out the general shape of that top sort of series of peaks, just to make sure I had the composition and scale right. I only used this one Sakura Micron 02 nib pen for this entire setup, and as you can see, you can get lighter lines and darker, bolder lines even using just one pen. You don't necessarily need a huge set with finer nibs and thicker nibs. It is nice to have those options, I won't lie, but it's not required to get varied line weights and a little bit more interest and detail in your line work. I stamped out February at the bottom just to finish off this spread and flipped over to the final series of spreads, which are going to be my weekly spreads. And for these, I am modifying my sort of new style of weekly, which I'm starting to think of a rolling monthly instead of a rolling weekly, because it does have quite a few similarities to what I have been doing with my rolling weekly. But this time I wanted to simplify it. I found that in January, I had so many separate lists to break down tasks into different categories. And I found myself increasingly as the month went on using the sort of overall priority lists for work and personal so much more on a regular basis than I was using all the detailed lists that I had to flip to that page to use. So this month I decided to just try that out, only having one list for work and one list for personal tasks for the entire month that I can see and write on no matter which day or which week I'm on. The rest of the setup is the same as I've been doing for the last couple months. I do really like this very simple sort of quadrant setup, and I've continued to include just a little priority task list on each weekly, just to highlight those tasks that might be more specifically dedicated to a specific week without necessarily having a very specific day that they have to be done. And then of course, creating a couple tabs as I love to do. And this time around, I decided to use some of this beautiful wavy washi tape from Amanda Rach Lee's new launch. Amanda sent me one of her new doodle planners and also a couple washi tapes, and I just love the creamy color of this washi tape in particular, and the wavy pattern is fun and interesting and different without being too overwhelming or clashing with the color scheme I already had going and the general simplicity of this setup. I'm really enjoying the simplicity of this one, and I'm happy that I included a little bit of color, even though the majority of the setup is quite simple and just focusing on clean lines and a black and white aesthetic. I'm really happy with my night sky versus golden hour mountain ranges, and love the combination of the watercolor background and the line art mountains. It's really fun to combine different art styles together in one piece. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Give it a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. We would love to have you here. Leave a mountain emoji in the comments if you made it all the way to the end, so I know you're a real one. And thank you as always to my patrons for your support. I appreciate appreciate you all so, so much. If you at home want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. And if you missed my last video, it was a makeover of my bedroom, the first room we finished in our first home that we've purchased. It was quite a long time coming, a very long-term project, but I love how it turned out. So if you missed it and you like home decor style videos, definitely check that one out. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you really soon for my next one, which is going to be a flip through of the bullet journal I used for the second half of 2022. So watch out for that and turn on notifications if you don't want to miss it. Okay, that's it. Bye, friends.